how to get into the Ivy Leagues, Oxford and Cambridge. Now, I have Kavita Singh to the right of me. She is, I think we mentioned before, founder and CEO of FutureWorks Consulting. Kavita did her undergraduate at Oxford University and followed it up with an MBA at Columbia Business School. To the left of me, I have Akanksha Bapna, who's the founder and CEO of Evaldesign. She did her master's degree at Harvard University and a PhD in biochemistry at the University of Cambridge. So both of them have got the UK-US perspective, Ivy League, and as you probably know, a lot of the UK universities at that level, Oxford and Cambridge, are known as being part of the Red Brick Consortium. So just a fun fact for you. I'm going to let both of them talk a little bit about their experiences, applying, getting in, attending. We'll start with Kavita.
Sure. So I'll talk about obviously undergrad and on business school, but so for me, I don't necessarily recommend this to my clients, but I had one dream, which was to get into Oxford, so I applied only to one university, but I don't suggest that everybody takes these risks because you really should have, backups and things like that. But I had made the decision that I would take a gap year and then figure out what I would do if I didn't get it. So applying to Oxford, I was very lucky. I was in a school where actually a lot of our teachers were from Oxford, so they understood the system and they could really, coach us through it. And really for Oxford or Cambridge at an undergraduate level, the most important part of the process is really your interview. So your interview, unlike other places, is held by professors, and it's essentially a debate going back and forth. So they'll ask you a question and ask you to argue through it, and they want to see if you have the ability to do that. And why do they do this? Because Oxbridge runs a tutorial system, right? So when you get to campus, they will give you a question and a reading list, and this reading list could be 20 to 30 books, and you read as little or as much as you think is important across the spectrum, and you write a paper and you present it to your tutor. It's you and another student and your tutor, and again you're debating back and forth on how you form this argument, how you could change it given information that the tutor is questioning you about or giving you new information to think through. And so that's what they're testing in the interview process is, would you be able to survive in this system and could you do really well? So if people are interested in Oxbridge at an undergraduate level, it becomes really important to understand that it is a different process and that you have to prepare differently for that. And a lot of students may not be used to that. That's okay. You could, but you need to spend time doing that reading to be able to have an intellectual discussion about your subject with a professor who's obviously a very learned person in that field. So I loved it. I chose it because of the tutorial system, and I had an absolutely fantastic experience, being at the university, and I wouldn't change a thing that I did there. So that was great, and that's one of the reasons I decided to do graduate school in the US was to actually have that sort of UK-US experience.
My experience was sort of the reverse of Kavita's. I did my undergraduate degree in India, and I did my first master's degree in NUS in Singapore. And then I went for a PhD to Cambridge. And I was on the other end of the tutorial system where I was teaching the undergraduates. So yes, it is exactly that, and you need to be very well prepared for that, and the interview process, etc., does that for you. I'll just tell you a little bit about the graduate admissions. That is not very much interview based. In fact, that is more based on what your application says in terms of your research. And that leads me to segue into your writing and your application process, if, I should probably. Okay. So I'll just kind of complete my journey. After Cambridge, I was studying science for another 4 or 5 years. I was a postdoc in the area of biophysics and biochemistry, after which I decided to change my field. And then went on to pursue another master's in international education policy at Harvard. So I applied for the Ivy League and Oxford and Cambridge 3 times in my life. One right after my undergraduate degree, one after my master's degree, and once after my PhD postdoc. In the first round, I was rejected from 14 universities. I got a scholarship from Singapore, so I decided to go there. In the second, and the reason was that we only had a 3-year undergraduate degree in India, and they did not accept that in the US anywhere. The second time round, I again applied to a whole lot of US universities and to Oxbridge, but this was more based on what my interest was. Again, I did not get through any of the US universities, and I landed up in Cambridge. At this point, I want to talk a little bit, and you have talked about financial aid in a previous session. So I got through my admissions process, but I did not have financial aid that year. And my master's advisor had told me that you do not pay to do a graduate degree, you get paid to do a graduate degree. So I refused to go there without a scholarship. I deferred it for a year and I reapplied for all possible scholarships that there were for Cambridge, and did end up getting the Commonwealth Scholarship, which is when I started my, my degree. After that, I went to the US, I was postdocing. And this time round, when, you know, like you had a dream to go to Oxford, I had a dream to go to Harvard. And that had carried through. And of course, at the end of your PhD and postdocing, you don't really think you're going to be going back to school. But I still had that dream going. And this time I only applied to one place, which was Harvard, and I got through. So your journey can be, you know, convoluted. It can be in any way. My one takeaway from this has been to, you know, if you have a dream, hold on to it and don't give up. And in this journey, I have written different kinds of statements of purpose, being rejected 3 times and finally being accepted. So I can talk a little bit about what seemed to have worked and what didn't seem to work as well. My initial statements of purpose right after my undergraduate degree were very dramatic. They were not necessarily utopian in that I'm going to change the world, which is what is expected of you and that's what you should be doing. But it also needs to be very grounded. You need to have done your background research. You just cannot come up and say something like, I'm going to find the cure for cancer, which is what I did. So I was in the biosciences at that point, and you know, I must have written something equivalent to saying, like, I'm going to solve this whole problem of cancer, which was kind of silly to do. What you need to do is go dig deeper. What kind of cancer would you want to work on? Which aspect of that cancer, and even which gene of that cancer that you need to work on. So you need to have done your homework when you're actually doing your applications. The time I applied, and this was a long, long time ago, we did not really have the kind of environment, and you're lucky to have that information with you, is you need to go and do internships, you can have your work experience, and you know, you have access to the internet, which we did not at that time even. My application processes involved actually walking over to Haley Road nearby, looking through these thick telephone directories of US universities and writing to them for brochures, which would come back, and then we would send in our applications. You have a lot more access these days. You need to be doing, you know, thinking about what next. It doesn't matter where you are, which school you are, or which university you are at. If you are the best at what you do, that's what will work for a US university. My last application, which got me to Harvard, was a very complex one to write. I was quitting 13 years of science, research, undergraduate, master's, PhD work to go and do something which was completely not related. I had to make a case for myself, which did not say something like, I'm actually, you know, done with science. But I had to make a case saying that I love science, but I still want to do this. I was very lucky to have had a conversation with a friend who's a philosopher and a logistician, no less. And in about 3 or 4 hours, she had questioned me on every aspect of what I really wanted to do, why I was doing that. And that is what came out in the application. It was very genuine. The logic was very strong. It was one story. I like science. It is not necessarily giving me what I want to do today, and therefore this is what I want to do. So that's the overall kind of statement that you need to be making for yourself. You need to be confident, not arrogant, but you need to have done your background work.
So Akanksha's touched a little bit on the importance of the essays and statements. Maybe Kavita can touch a little bit on the importance of the interview, you know,
Sure.
that especially for Oxford, Cambridge, you have to have a face-to-face interview.
So you have to, well, you might have face-to-face interviews in the US system as well. Not everybody interviews when it comes down to it. And there are many reasons why they often don't have enough, you know, alumni to interview. But there are many universities that do. So University of Pennsylvania will, you know, interview pretty much every candidate, which is different to the Oxford type interview, which I talked about earlier, where that's much more academic. It's run by professors. Here in the US, it might be an admissions officer or an alumni, like I do Columbia Business School interviews for people who want to apply to the business school. So it could be another alumni who's actually interviewing you. And what they're doing in the US, which is different, it's much more what we call behavioral type questions. So they'll ask you questions like, so tell us what's been your most challenging leadership experience, or tell us about a time that you failed. And what they're really trying to see, and they want details. So a lot of times people will answer these questions very broadly and there are no specifics. They really want to understand, what makes you different. So what about that leadership experience, which may not be the biggest thing in the world, but what was interesting about it? What did you do in that instance that really sets you apart from someone, right? So was there a crisis? Were you able to really manage a crisis really well? Were you able to motivate people who were completely demotivated and turn around a situation? Or in failure type questions, what have you learned from that failure? How has it shaped you going forward? They want to know that you've tried things, that you've taken risks, and that you know how to learn from mistakes. So there's nothing wrong with making mistakes. If it shapes you, you can learn from it. It might change you as you go forward. And that's what they're really trying to see. They're also trying to understand what really sets you apart. So we've seen your test scores, we've seen certain things that do interest you, but how are you going to communicate in a classroom? So we want people in a classroom who are going to add value, bring a unique perspective, challenge somebody else. So challenging things is a good thing in the US system. It may not always be, depending on which country you're in. Maybe you're not so used to challenging your teacher in your classroom in school, but in the US they want you to challenge them. So sometimes even writing the essay, if they have an interesting essay question, it's challenging the question itself, saying, I'm not sure I agree with this question, can lead to a much more interesting essay than just simply sort of answering it. And that's what they're really looking for in an interview. And obviously your communication skills. So practicing interviews, really getting down to specifics, showing rather than telling. This is the same thing with essays. You really have to give details. They really want to understand it, because to answer questions generally is very easy. Everybody's answers will then sound the same. But truly, what are these little kernels of things that set you apart is really what they're looking for. So the US and Oxbridge have very different interview processes, where in Oxbridge they're looking to understand your academic, intellectual abilities, and can you debate back and forth, while in the US it'll be many more of these sort of behavioral type questions to see what sets you apart, what makes you unique, what is your personality behind all of these other achievements that you have, and what are you going to really bring to our campus as a result.
I'm just going to take another quick evaluation. How many of you are looking at undergraduate, and how many, undergraduate programs?
Pretty much.
So the majority of the room. And is anyone here looking for graduate school abroad?
A few.
Okay, so there's a few people. So, we can touch very generally on test scores as well. Akanksha's had more experience at the graduate level. So perhaps you can just tell us a little bit about, the kind of tests that you sort of took for your field and the impact, how they use that.
So I actually just had to take the GREs. In some universities, you're required to take a subject GRE as well, but I think that's getting less and less common so. But I find that test scores do not necessarily say or, stamp or brand you as to whether you are going to get into the Ivy League or not. I took GREs twice 10 years apart when I went back to school. My second time round I had lower scores than I had the first time. They were also probably just at the average of what the school required, and usually you want to be above the average for sure. But I guess in my case it sort of made up for the statement of purpose, which had a lot of reason behind why I really wanted to do this. So it's a balance between your statement, your references, and your scores. And if you think you've taken your exam once, and I think these days they allow you to repeat it again in a short span of time. But even then, if you're not satisfied with your scores, you definitely can make up with it. It shouldn't be way off what the school requires, but make up with it for what you've actually done and shown for yourself.
Do you think you could touch on the GMAT very briefly?
Sure.
I know a lot of you are looking at undergrad, but the GMAT is for business schools.
Yeah, so with the GMAT, just like what you were saying, I totally agree with you. You really would prefer to be, above the average, and they used to very high scores from Indian students because, usually they've already, these students have already prepared for like IIT entrance exams, so they find the GMAT pretty easy. But we've been very successful getting students in with lower scores because they have something interesting, they have something unique, just like you were saying, in their background. And I think that's the key, whether it's undergrad undergrad or postgraduate admissions is not to look like everybody else. It's to stand apart. So if you have esoteric interests, if you have something unique about your background, it's to highlight that, enhance it. If you're in class 10, 9, 10, 11, you have 2, 3 years maybe to enhance some of those more esoteric interests. Or if you're applying to grad school, you have an opportunity to bring out something that sets you apart. And that's what they're really looking for, because they don't want a classroom full of people who are all like each other. That doesn't necessarily lead to an interesting discussion. They want people who are going to provoke thought, bring a different perspective. And I think that's critical. So yes, it's helpful to have a higher GMAT score, but we've seen people get into Ivy Leagues with lower because of this. And if you do have a unique profile, someone can assess that for you and say, yes, well, in your case, you might be able to get in with a lower score because you've got something really interesting in your background.